In this section, we're going to talk about the Republic of China. The early years of the Republic were essentially an extension of the late Qing dynasty in every aspect of life. As there was no large-scale fighting across the country, and power was transitioned mostly through negotiation, life did not change much for most people. The new government, with Yuan Shikai at the top, was still packed with former Qing officials. The revolutionists who followed Sun Yat-Sen were largely sidelined as they had no real power. The new government was pretty much an experiment for China, as most people who ran the country were not used to democratic ideas. Yuan Shikai even at the time proclaimed himself emperor, and Puyi, the former Qing emperor, also staged a coup and later briefly restored his empire for a few days. However, new ideas, and especially young students, continued to push for reformation, and despite the chaos in the first few years, it is without a doubt a time when people enjoyed freedom of thoughts and speech. One of the most defining moments in the early years of Republican China was the May 4th movement. It started as a result of China's victory at the end of World War I. Despite not having participated in the front line, China helped the Allied forces by sending tens of thousands of workers to construct the trenches in France in the hope of gaining back control of the German settlements in Shandong province. However, Japan had already negotiated a deal with Britain and France and was allowed to succeed Germany's colonies and interests in the area in exchange for its contribution in the war. As a result, China was invited to the treaties of Versailles but without getting what it wanted. When the news came back to China, students became furious at the government for its inability to protect Chinese interests. They launched protests and chanted nationalistic slogans. They also organized study clubs to find ways to strengthen the country. One of them was a group of communists led by Chen Dushou, a professor at Peking University. Influenced by the then successful revolution in Russia, they would develop into today's Chinese Communist Party. Meanwhile, in the south, the old Revolutionary Party with Sun Yat-sen as its leader found a base in Guangdong. Rebranding themselves as the Nationalists or Kuomintang, they decided to accept help from the Soviet Union and the Chinese Communist Party. Under the advice of Russian military officers, they formed the Wampa Military Academy in Guangzhou, with a young revolutionist called Chiang Kai-Shek as its leader. After Sun died, Chiang Kai-shek emerged as the leader of the Nationalist Party. With the help of his well-trained army, he launched a campaign against the northern warlords and successfully united the country. Chiang Kai-shek has always been skeptical about the Chinese Communist Party, who joined the KMT under the instructions of the Soviets. In 1928, days after he captured Shanghai, he ordered a mass execution of all the Communist Party members inside KMT. It was a serious blow to communism in China, and for the next several years, his armies chased the communists throughout the country. As the communists were forced to leave the city and escape through the countryside, a power struggle also ensued within the party. The Soviets from Russia and the idealistic elites like Chen Dushou soon lost influence to a young man called Mao Zedong. Mao, who came from the countryside, knew that China's main problem was the farmers, its vast farmer population and injustice in land distribution, and he successfully led the communists in what is known as the Long March and escaped the KMT's army to Yan'an. Despite constant war with the communists and regional warlords, the decade between the Northern Expedition and the start of the Second World War was a relative period of prosperity in China, especially in the KMT controlled Shanghai. For the first time in several years, the country was in peace and the government was overall friendly to capitalism. Shanghai became the largest city in East Asia and was dubbed as the Pearl of the East. Western fashion bloomed in China, evident in the wedding photograph of Chiang Kai-Shek and his wife Sun Mei-ling. Traditional Chinese dresses also took some ideas from Western fashion, and to this day, qipao is still considered as an elegant dressing for women in formal occasions in China. Despite the prosperity in Shanghai, the country at large was under heavy pressure from Japan. Devastated by the Great Depression in 1929, Japan desperately needed China's resources to sustain its failing economy. In 1931, the Japanese occupied the northeastern provinces during the Manchurian Incident. They invited the former Qing Emperor Puyi to form a puppet regime Manchukuo. Japan, knowing that China is too large to conquer as a whole, opted for a strategy to take up China bits by bits. Chiang Kai-shek knew about Japanese aggression, but calculated that he needed a few more years to build up his strength before he could fight the Japanese. Instead, he put his attention on the communists, telling the country that in order to fight outside aggressors, enemy from the inside should be eliminated first. Many people across the country were deeply disappointed with his policy for not acting against Japan, including the general in charge of fighting the communists, Zhang Xueliang. In December 1936, while Chiang Kai-shek was visiting frontline troops fighting the communists, Zhang Xueliang kidnapped him and forced him to stop the civil war and unite the country against Japanese aggression. This was remembered as the Xi'an incident, and many people credited Zhang Xueliang for saving the Communist Party. On July 7, 1937, the Japanese army launched another attack, this time at the city of Beijing, in the Marco Polo Bridge, and having promised to the country to fight on the Japanese, Chiang Kai-shek ordered the National Army to launch a full-scale war against the Japanese. To exhaust the Japanese supply line and to draw international attention, China provoked the Japanese in Shanghai in an effort to divert their forces. Bitter fightings were fought in Shanghai for 3 months until the Japanese finally took the city and the nearby capital Nanjing. Shocked and angered by heavy Chinese resistance, the Japanese massacred tens of thousands of innocent civilians and POWs in Nanjing. Meanwhile, the Chinese government retreated to the province of Sichuan and would continue the war against Japan alone for 4 more years, until US aid came when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941. Today, World War II is mostly remembered in China as the War of Resistance against Japan. Although war became bitter at home as the Nationalist army fought hard against the military superior Japanese, China made significant gain in international status. Being an important allied power and bogging down millions of Japanese soldiers in the Chinese theater, China was recognized as one of the Big Four. Unequal treaties signed during the Qing dynasty were cancelled, and Chiang Kai-shek, with his English fluent wife Sun Mei-ling, met with Roosevelt and Churchill at Cairo to discuss the post-war order of the world. After 8 years of bitter war, the Allied finally defeated the Japanese after the Americans dropped 2 atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. At last, China became the victor. Overall, more than 20 million Chinese lives were lost, and the country was in total destruction. The national government under Chiang Kai-shek suffered heavy damage from personnel lost in military campaigns, while the Communist Party benefited greatly from the war as it gained popularity through guerrilla warfare and rural land reform behind the lines.